Imagine waking up in pitch-black darkness. Your hand strikes solid wood inches from your face. Above you, heavy dirt thuds violently against the planks. During the 18th and 19th centuries, thousands of people lived with the verified risk of being interred while their hearts were still beating. Primitive medicine lacked the tools to reliably detect a faint heartbeat or a shallow breath. Doctors frequently confused deep comas or conditions like catalepsy with rigor mortis, often declaring death when the body was simply in a state of suspended animation. Without the technology to prove biological death, the border between the living and the dead was a terrifyingly educated guess. When cholera or yellow fever swept through a city, fear of contagion led to burials occurring within mere hours of a supposed passing. People like Alice Blunden, a victim of a heavy sedative, or Octavia Hatcher, who succumbed to a deep sleeping sickness, were lowered into the ground while still biologically alive. When their graves were opened years later, the evidence was undeniable. Authorities found burial shrouds torn to ribbons and the undersides of coffin lids gouged with deep, bloody scratch marks. These reports filled newspaper broadsheets across Europe and America. As the stories of Alice and Octavia circulated, the simple act of falling asleep became a source of widespread anxiety. This cycle of traumatic discovery and sensational news coverage transformed a medical failure into a defining cultural anxiety, leaving an entire generation obsessed with the integrity of the grave. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe amplified this dread, describing premature burial as the ultimate human agony. This gave rise to a diagnosed psychological epidemic, taphophobia. To prevent this fate, people began writing gruesome instructions into their final wills. They demanded that their surgeons cut their throats, pierce their hearts, or remove their heads entirely before the funeral to ensure that they were truly gone. Doctors responded by inventing agonizing ways to test for life. They used massive tongue pullers and the pence memalon, a spiked nipple pincher, hoping that intense physical pain would force a comatose patient to scream or flinch. In Germany, cities established leichenhauser, or waiting mortuaries. Bodies were kept in heated rooms for days under constant supervision. Attendants waited for the first signs of decomposition, as active rotting was the only proof of death they trusted. Medical science had entered a brutal cycle, attempting to force a non-responsive body to prove it was no longer capable of feeling. For those who couldn't wait days in a mortuary, a new industry emerged, the commercial manufacture of safety coffins. The most famous design was the Bateson revival bell, a physical fail-safe connecting the victim below to the world above. If the person awoke, any hand movement pulled a cord running up a copper tube, ringing a loud bell mounted above the grave. But nature eventually intervened. As a body naturally decomposes, it gasifies and shifts. This movement frequently pulled the strings from the inside, ringing bells in the middle of the night and forcing families to dig up their loved ones only to find them still dead. Other designs featured spring-loaded escape hatches. However, the inventors ignored the physics of the cemetery. 6 feet of wet earth exerts thousands of pounds of crushing weight, making it impossible for a human to push the lid open from below. These inventions provided a sense of security, but they ultimately failed against the rigid laws of biology and physics. Taphophobia began to fade during the American Civil War. Shipping fallen soldiers thousands of miles home necessitated a new standard of preservation, embalming. By replacing the body's blood with formaldehyde, morticians created the first absolute guarantee. Because no human can survive the embalming process, the open casket became a site of biological certainty rather than suspicion. Simultaneously, the stethoscope allowed doctors to finally hear the faintest pulse, closing the diagnostic gap that caused so many burials in error. By defining physiological boundaries with new tools and chemical finality, modern science drew a permanent line between life and death. As the fear of the waking dead vanished, our coffins changed. We replaced escape tubes and bells with soft, tufted velvet and silk, designed to comfort the living with the peaceful illusion of sleep. Our monitoring technology continued to evolve, shifting the legal definition of death from the stopping of the heart to total cessation of brain activity. Today, our measurement of life tracks the faintest electrical hum of the brain and the exact oxygen saturation of the blood, sculpting a level of precision that has inverted our ancestral fear. The Victorian wills that once begged for a cutthroat have been replaced by modern do not resuscitate orders, documents that demand we be allowed to slip away. It is the ultimate irony of our progress. We conquered the terror of being buried alive, only to become terrified of being kept alive.